Thank you, Christina. So thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to spend with us. I'm looking forward to especially the Q&A at the end. I always prefer to have interaction. This will probably be around 20 minutes of talking. And anything you want to talk about, just note it down, and I'll go back to any point that we make in here. As far as my own background, I've been here now at Insight for over 3 years. It doesn't seem like that long. And my background is previous to coming to Insight, I was the general manager of several businesses at a company called TravelClick, which was owned by Genstar. I ran 4 businesses there. Each business had about 5 products. The total revenue was $300 million across those businesses. I didn't run all of them when I started. I started running a couple businesses and then took over the additional businesses before leaving. I came here after meeting Jeff Horing, and he suggested, when I was looking at portfolio companies, why don't you come in-house and try this operating partner thing? And after several months being on the market, I decided I would take him up on it and see what it was like. And it's been a great experience. In particular, I really like working with portfolio companies and talking to management. I'm always having the most fun when I'm talking to the people running the companies. So for me, this is exciting to do. As far as my background, before that, I started out, when I graduated from college, I started a record company with a friend of mine. That makes for a lot of fun stories. I had to park cars to make money and work selling magazine subscriptions over the phone. So I've actually been an inside salesperson previously. And then I went to Amex, and I spent 14 years there. I had a pit stop at Ticketmaster, sort of transitioning to the corporate world before I went to Amex. And that's where I fell in love with software. I was on a team that did strategic partnerships and investments in software companies during the internet boom, and I invested in both Concur and OpenTable when they were tiny companies, and really fell in love with the business model, and sort of that was where my love of software began. And I grew up at Amex in product marketing and demand gen, both phone-based and digital. Did a lot of large strategic product and channel partnerships, and spent my entire career in either mid-market enterprise or the small business space. Go-to-market motions ranging from entirely digital to enterprise sales supported by classic field enablement. I took a brief detour in ad tech before going to TravelClick, one of the things that I learned as an operator that I think really helps us here at Insight partner with portfolio companies is how important HR was to my success. We had every week we had our executive team meeting, and I always made our lead recruiter join those meetings. And most of the time in those meetings was spent fighting over who got access to that lead recruiter's capacity, because we always had way more jobs to fill than we had recruiters to do it. And so prioritizing that time was important, and running a tight process was important. And a lot of that really is how I ended up doing talent here. I did not come here to do talent. I came here to be an operating partner. I did a temporary stint as a CEO for one of our portfolio companies. I was working on sales and go-to-market stuff, and then one day they asked me to do this, and it's really been an awesome experience, and I've really enjoyed getting to know several of the HR leaders in the organization, and I'm excited to meet more of you. So with that said, I'm going to proceed. Normally I'd do Q&A at this point, but I can't do so. So one of the things I have to do in my job that I'm forced to do when Christina holds a gun to my head is write articles, which I really don't like to do. I'd rather talk than write. So one of the first things, part of the reason Christina got me motivated, or how she got me motivated, was to ask what I really cared about. And I said, well, one of the things that bugs me is bad recruiting processes, because I see it all the time. And so we decided to do this article, and we sort of put down the things, and we didn't invent these things. We take them from many different places. Some of them come from academic articles. Some of them come from blogs written by successful recruiters. Some of them come from Laszlo Bock's book at Google. There's lots of different places we've taken these things from. And then some of this comes from interviewing the MDs here and CEOs and what they say works. And so this, to me, is a accumulation of all of that input and our own experience. And we now track this for every search that we possibly can, which is why some of you hear from me at the end of each quarter asking about searches, because we're trying to see how much this correlates to success. And so you can read the article. There's a link to it I think Christina will provide. And I'm going to talk about a lot of that in this conversation today. So the first thing, I think the most important thing is creating a scorecard. If you talk with any of the professional evaluations or assessment firms, can you go back? Because I don't know that. If you talk to any of the professional firms like a Green Peak or a Blake Street, or even the large exec recruiters that do, Fortune 50 CEO hires, they always do this. And the reason to create a scorecard is because you need to hold everyone accountable. And the founder needs to hold themselves accountable, or the CEO needs to hold themselves accountable, that they're actually hiring for what they need in the job and has been agreed upon and defined, rather than hiring based on their biases. So I can tell you that I have a bias for smart and I don't know what the word is, but certain degree of persuasive people, I would say. And I would consciously hire more disciplined, more like, I'm not an I dotter or T crosser. So I would hire people like that, and they would help me check my own biases in hiring, because they would hire for people who are a lot more, detail oriented and into the sort of the critical details that you need to get things done. But that alone wouldn't create good hiring. The other thing we found is that if we didn't write down and define what was critical to hiring success, then we would fail in hiring. And the number of times I've seen a founder torpedo a candidate that everyone agreed upon around the actual skills that were needed for the job for some unspoken criteria is half the time this happens. And once that happens, we say, okay, what is that unspoken criteria? What is it you're looking for? And we put it in writing. And so having the scorecard allows you to have an explicit discussion. So if we go to the next page, I'm showing you 3 scorecards here because I often get a request of send me a CEO scorecard. And I always say that doesn't work that way. Each scorecard is unique. There's a lot of similarities that we've identified a bunch of traits that matter in CEOs, like work ethic and resilience and being secure in their competence. Yes. But there's a lot more than that. Being great at hiring and building leadership teams. But there's a lot of subtlety and specificity to each job. And so what this scorecard allows you to do is make sure that you're interviewing for the specific job. So these are 3 different actual real scorecards for CEO hires we've done. And what you'll notice is how different they are. And this is in priority order. So the first one, they really need a GM. Whereas, and that's because that company is at a little bit more scale, and they're lacking really this mentality of approaching in terms of how they make decisions at this company, and they really needed better decision making and more discipline around how they made decisions and what they measured and where they invested in the business. Whereas the second company was this like sneaky single segment product that we think had huge upside. And we went out and found someone who'd done something just like this before, where they had gone to a company that was run by a founder. And the story the guy told me in the interview is, the founder hired all his friends. And before I took the job, I said, if I have to fire your friends, is it going to be a problem? And the guy said, no, which is usually a lie. But in this case, the guy said, no, I won't have a problem with it. And he showed up and he said, within 3 months, he said, you have 100 people, you should have 10. They fired 90 people and then rebuilt the team from the ground up back to 100 over a year and a half as they grew, because they were going to run out of money and the company would have folded. And they eventually sold it to Barnes & Noble. And when this guy told me the story, I knew he knew, and he basically worked with, he didn't hire other execs. He carried the burden. He hired junior and mid-level people, and that's what we were looking for in this job. If you look at the second item here, it says, must be able to be hands-on, but also strategic enough to make the right business decisions. This guy has gone out and hired junior people to be on his leadership team. He's very hands dirty because the company can't afford a super expensive CEO who's going to come in with an 8-person leadership team, all of who make, north of $200,000 a year. And then the third one is very different from the first one because there it's about the product market fit. We know these guys are onto something. There's a lot of competition. Where is it best to sell? And so that is a real difference between 3 different CEO jobs. And what we do with these scorecards is we insist that people interview and rate and take notes against these And more importantly, we make people get on the phone to debrief on the interviews. It's not done by an email. It's not done by walking by the guy's window and giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It's getting in a room and saying, okay, how did they score against this? How did they score against that? What do you think of them overall? Why would you hire them? Why wouldn't you hire them? So this is really probably one of the two most important things I think to do. One other thing I just wanted to say is I hate job descriptions. Job descriptions are marketing pieces to try to attract talent. But when people say, I'm going to send you a job description, to me, for internally, the scorecard is everything. The job description is based on the scorecard. You should not publish the scorecard, but you should look at the scorecard and say, okay, how are we going to talk about this job? It's like a marketing piece. You don't just show a person your product to sell it. You also have to market it and talk about it. You have to sort of extract the key elements to do a marketing message. Well, the job description is just a marketing message for a scorecard. So I hate them as a way to evaluate candidates or source candidates. They're really a way to attract candidates. Okay, so the next item, I think the next sort of sin is looking for the cheap and easy candidate. And so let's go to the next page and see what we have here. Yeah. So I think that a lot of this happens because, and again, I speak from personal experience, you know who you know and you trust them and you want to hire them into these jobs because you know you can rely on them. And a lot of it is comfort with their style and their work ethic and all these other things. And that's how I actually ran my last business. I hired in, everyone I hired came from my old company. Not everyone, I should say. Most of my initial hires came from my old company. I hired a few critical people off the street and I promoted several people from within. But my core team, except for maybe one person, were all people I brought in from outside, and they were all people from my personal network. It worked out very well for me because it was an unhunted group of talent that really were ripe for the opportunity. However, after I left and I came here and I saw the degree of talent in the market, I realized how limiting it was and how much great talent there is out there. And I consistently find that people who over-rely on their network are missing out on upgrading talent. They're hunting in a very small pool. So I think going to your network only can be a mistake. And I think that it's really important to go out and survey the market and see what talent's out there and see who you can get. And I think it's worth the risk, but I think people don't do it because they don't like to go after the unknown. And this is why I'm also a big believer in recruiters. I know they cost money, but the recruiter's job is to go out and find out who's on the market that you could get. And sort of doing a search without a recruiter is like trying to sell a B2B product without a BDR and SDR team or without marketing, right? You know, you're gonna go out as a single salesperson and try to find all your clients, or are you gonna try to amplify what you're doing? The recruiter's an amplification, and people get focused on the cost of recruiters. But we find, and we've been tracking, that our most consistently successful searchers are when we use recruiters. So why don't people want to use recruiters? We find it's because there are a lot of bad recruiters out there, and all it takes is a couple bad recruiter experiences for people to say, I don't want to work with these recruiters. But what we find is that because we have so many at-bats, we know who the great recruiters are for what roles and what size companies. Just because a recruiter is great, my CEO recruiter, I would never ask that person to do a VP of sales search. He wouldn't be good at it. He wouldn't pay attention to it. And it's very different than our CIO recruiter. So if you're ever looking for references, we can always provide that. But I believe going cheap and easy is a mistake. And you should take the effort to survey the market, especially when hiring execs. Obviously, frontline's a little bit different. The third is over-delegating the search. If you could say what's the biggest sin, this is it. An unengaged CEO or a CEO who flies in and flies out, or a founder who flies in and flies out, or a founder who lets their team do all the work and then torpedoes a candidate at the end of the process. That is the most destructive thing that can happen to a search. And so when I see a bad search, it's one of two profiles, and it's almost always the CEO that is the problem, right? In other words, it's the CEO or the founder. If the CEO or founder is engaged and behaving appropriately, the search tends to go exceptionally well. There's a reason they're in charge of the company, and they set the tone and culture. They know what they're looking for in talent, and there are things and tools we can put around the process as HR professionals to help make sure that they execute it correctly. But if you get an autocratic CEO who basically doesn't empower their team in any way, shape, or form, that can prove really bad, especially because candidates start to opt out because the process is kind of haphazard and screwed up, and they sense it, and that happens a lot. Or you get the CEO who over-delegates and doesn't really own the process at all, and they let their team do everything, and it really requires a balance. And I really think it's the job of the HR professionals to corral their CEO and make sure that they make good use of their time, that they run an efficient process, but that the CEO is engaged. The next, let's see, is there anything else I want to talk about here? I just wanted to talk about why it's important the CEOs participating. It's because especially in the weekly recruiter meetings, it's that dialogue between the recruiter and the CEO that takes 2 to 3 weeks of interactions before everybody gets it. And sometimes it takes longer because sometimes the recruiter isn't hearing it correctly. Sometimes the CEO isn't being articulate enough. And they need to, and sometimes the CEO needs to see candidates before they can do a better job. Often, after they've seen 4 or 5 candidates, they start to give feedback, and then the recruiter gets it. And so you need that. And also, great candidates, they want their first call to be with the CEO. And we found that when the CEO is upfront in the process, we get better candidates and better outcomes. So that's the other reason why over-delegation is bad. Okay. So the next is not having a candidate value proposition. I meant to tell you, Christina, I don't, go ahead, go to the next page. I don't understand this graphic, but that's okay. It's the only thing I didn't understand in the presentation. But what I would say is the following, that, candidates are choosing a job. It's a bigger life decision than anything they make besides maybe, buying a house. And even then, I think it's a bigger decision than that. Maybe not financially, but it's their personal time. And they want to have income, they want to have career growth, and they want to have happiness in their job. And so it's really important to be clear about what you are and what you're not, and be honest about what you are and what you're not. What type of company you are, what the growth is like, what the culture is like. And you have to think about how to sell your company's strengths. So what is it that makes your company what you are? How do you want to sell it? How do you want to position it? And being really thoughtful and conscious about that and the role. Most good execs can suss out BS in a job description or search. Anytime I get it's super confidential and, it's a really hot company, you get this recruiter and, and they're just, and you just tell, and you say, how many CMOs have they had? And they fired the last 2 CMOs, and, nothing's worse than the large corporation trying to create like an innovation lab, and they want to hire a person out of tech to come in, that almost always ends in a disaster. So there's a lot of things that executives see, and they're not dumb. And so it's just best to be honest with yourself about who you are, know what your strengths are, and sell your strengths. And actually at my last company, we were very honest about our weaknesses. We were very clear about our culture and what it was like to make sure that we didn't get people, because we had a couple people flame out. And I still remember the CEO of our company getting angry at me, the CFO, and one other guy when we brought a candidate in to be CMO, and we said, this is what it's really like here. And the guy's like, thanks, but no thanks. And he was very upset with us, but we said, listen, we're not going to go through this again. We tried to tell this to you. So let's get on the same page about how we're talking about the company. And we did, and it made a much bigger difference in who we attracted, because it was not for the faint of heart, that company. So anyway, that is, I think, really critical. And even the engagement strategy, like, do you leverage, if you're trying to get an A+, president to support a founder, or an A+ CRO to support a CEO, and you don't have a network, do your investors have relationships? Does a call from an investor where somebody says, we often say, Jeff Horing would like to talk to you, to just some person who we are aiming high. And in fact, that's how we sourced the president of Showpad. Basically we called up this guy who was the president of Marketo, which was a lot bigger than Showpad, and said, Jeff Horing wants to have a conversation with you. The guy said, great. Jeff Horing spoke to him, talked to him about Insight, what it's like to be part of the Insight family, and then said, hey, we've got this opportunity at a portfolio company you might want to look at. And that's the guy we ended up hiring, right? So, it's not just the value prop, but it's also how you use your CEO and founder, how you use your board members. What do you do to get candidates into the pipeline? We find these things really work. Next is hiring primarily based on pedigree and experience. So I'll give an example. Again, I'm going to go to my personal experience, but my entire team at my last company working in software all came from outside of software. One of my biggest frustrations when I first came to Insight is this idea that we have to hire people out of software. But there are actually industries that have been running recurring revenue models like telecom and financial services for much, much longer, and business services for much longer than software. Software was a licensed maintenance model. It was a giant whale hunting business in the corporate space. It wasn't SMB and middle market enterprise recurring revenue. And so these industries were super sophisticated at customer success and trigger-based account management and targeting and segmentation. And yet we don't look in those areas. And so what I did is I hired everyone out of non-software. And, we took a company that was growing at 2% and in 4 years got it to 15%. That's EBITDA. Oh, no, that's revenue. Got it to 15% revenue growth. And, instead of selling it for 2x, sold it for 4.5x investment. So, this is just hiring because people come from the industry doesn't always make sense. So I'm going to give an example here. I wish I could hear you guys, but these are all coaches. These are the winningest coaches in the history of the NFL, either Super Bowl or NFL. It's actually NFL or AFL championships. I don't know how many are on here, but they've all won multiple championships. So my question is, how many of these guys were experienced CEOs or experienced head coaches before they were hired? Because often I hear investors say to me, I want an experienced CEO. And the same thing goes for CRO or CMO. And why do people want that? Because it makes them feel safer about their decision. They've done it before. But a lot of experienced people, do they have experience at a B firm with B results, which could still be nice growth and whatever, or do they have A results? How hard was the situation they faced? How good of a job did they do? What did they do to make the impact? Was it them? Was it just great product market fit, et cetera, et cetera? And so what you'll find is if you go to the next page here, you'll see that most of these coaches were first-time head coaches. Only 3 of them were, so you look at the winningest coaches in history, only 3 of them were retreads. Bill Belichick, Don Shula, and Tom Coughlin. 3 of them retreads. And they were all retreads for reasons. And Belichick is the most famous. He inherited a pretty bad situation and was fired too early. But he also didn't know what he was doing and had to learn some things. But if they had stuck with it, he probably would have been successful. But all these other guys, they were first-time head coaches. And in fact, what's really interesting about this, and this is where great organizations produce great people, Tom Landry and Vince Lombardi and one other guy in here, I can't remember, were both assistant coaches for the same winning franchise in the 1950s. And they passed over them and they went to 2 different organizations and brought them to multiple Super Bowls. So they both worked for the New York Giants. One was the offensive coordinator, one was the defensive coordinator. They won multiple championships when they were there. And they moved on to other jobs. The point is they came from a great pedigree. And if you look at the NFL, most of the head coaches come from a few people's coaching trees. There are a few head coaches that have produced great talent over and over and over. And in fact, right now, many of the head coaches in the NFL all worked and played for a guy named Andy Reid, who unfortunately has yet to win a Super Bowl, but he's been a consistent winner. So again, who they work for and how successful they people are and what kind of leadership teams they build, organizations they build, I think is as much of a predictor of success as to whether someone's held the job before. And then sin number 6 is a light hiring process. So this is really about taking the time. So when I do there's a CEO that we work with who's ex-military, and we were having this conversation, and when I was talking about how important I thought it was to have a thorough hiring process, and he said, and he was a Marine officer, and he said to me, it's 22 interviews before you get accepted into a Marine as a frontline recruit. 22 interviews. And the Marines did not believe you could get to know a person. Now, obviously, we're not going to do 22 interviews, but another example I'll give you is some of the biggest, most successful private equity investors in the world who write a lot bigger checks than us and run a lot bigger organizations than us said they will not hire a CEO until they've done 25 reference checks. 25. So going fast to go fast and being in a hurry doesn't make sense. What you have to do is move with purpose and fast. In other words, don't waste time in your process, which is going to be my next bullet. But be thorough. And so as an example, when I do interviews, I always schedule an hour and a half. And the first 30 to 45 minutes is a speed dating review of the person's entire work history, starting with where they went to school and why they chose their major, all the way through tell me about each job very quickly. What did you do? What did you accomplish? One, I get to see, do they talk too much? You know, can they not stay on schedule? Are they articulate? Do they understand what the company did? Do they understand their place in the company? And it gives me a lot of the answers to stuff I was going to ask anyway doing the job history review. But I will always schedule a follow-up meeting if I don't then get to the scorecard questions, because I do all that before I even go into the scorecard. And it's an hour and a half. I typically spend 2 hours with almost every candidate I interview, 2 hours with each candidate. Good CEOs will meet multiple times with their people that they're trying to hire. And when people come into the office, what you want is you really want your executives that you're advising and coaching for these reviews, especially when it's someone's going to be on the leadership team. You want them to take it seriously in terms of being focused and not being lazy and saying these are the scorecard questions you're covering and not because I've been there. I've been the exec that's like, I am too exhausted. We're trying to sell the company right now, or we're trying to win a client, and I don't do my job interviewing. And every time I've done that, we've hired poorly. And when I do my job and I'm disciplined, we hire successfully. So again, this is all coming back to what's our role. I spend most of my time sort of advocating and trying to make sure that executives, like support them, kind of like if you're on a diet and you need like somebody who's your sponsor who's going to be like, hey, don't forget to, don't break your diet. I feel like part of my job is to make sure that they take the time to interview correctly, that they take the time to do the reference checks correctly, that they take the time to run a proper process, that they do the interview, that they make sure the leadership team focuses and uses the scorecard. It's just like a giant advocacy role and giant cheerleader role. And yet, obviously, there's a purpose behind it. And it's to make sure people are disciplined, because having been in their shoes, it's exhausting. On top of the day job, no one's punishing you for not doing your hiring. But the reality is it's the most important thing you do. But people are punishing you if you don't get that sale, or you don't return that email, you don't deal with that client issue, you don't deal with that investor issue. But it's just too important. There's a joke amongst my employees at my last company that recruiting is priority 0, because we would do priorities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'd say, okay, now recruiting, this is priority 0. It comes in front of everything else. You're not allowed to ever tell me you couldn't make an interview or you couldn't follow up on a recruiting thing, because once you get new talent in, that's good. It lightens everybody's load, and it's easy to push recruiting down the priority list. And then last is creating a terrible candidate experience. Did I not have notes on this? No, these are real examples of searches I've been involved in the last year. These are for senior leadership roles. Making a candidate come in 5 or 6 times is ridiculous. It should be recruiter call, CEO call, then next round should be the serious assessment round, either another in-person with the CEO and some sort of experienced operator interviewing, right? And then the site visit with all the peers, and you're done. 4 rounds, and 8 people, I think, is the max that should ever meet a candidate. I think the ideal number is 5 to 7. And if you exclude a recruiter, maybe 4 to 6. But you have to decide. And then it's having them. It's not letting 3 or 4 weeks or a month pass between meetings. You don't need to move like in the next day, but you want to make progress each week. The end-to-end experience should be from the time a candidate's first contacted until an offer's made and accepted should be, that wasn't 40 days to hire, by the way, that's a typo, it was a lot longer than that. I think it was 60 days and we still hadn't made the offer. But to me, it should be 4 to 6 weeks from first contact till offer accepted. So that's 30 to 45 days, I think it is. So, this is just too long of a process. With that, I think we're going to take questions. Again,